Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for October 3rd, 2024. Today in Germany, this is known as the Tag der Deutschen Einheit, the Day of German Unity. It was 34 years ago, in 1990, that East Germany was dissolved and the reunification of Germany occurred. This was a moment of tremendous potential to move beyond the divide of the Cold War into a new era of peace and economic cooperation. Germany had been divided at the end of World War II. There was an eastern zone which was controlled by the Soviet Union. The West had forces from France, Germany, and the United States. The Berlin Wall was built in August 13th, 1961, at a moment of tremendous tension. In fact, there was tension throughout much of this period as there were people leaving Eastern Germany. The West was prospering, was growing under the German economic miracle, and yet the East was part of the Warsaw Pact. It was not experiencing development. In fact, it was a surveillance state. It was a state in which you had the so-called Stasi, the secret police. And people who lived here during that period will tell you that every day you'd look out the window and you'd see people looking through their windows at you. You had a sense of constant surveillance. It was somewhat captured in the John le Carré novel, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. But what was clear was that there was no freedom and there was very little hope. Now, that changed in September 1989, when you had the Monday night demonstrations that began in Leipzig. The demonstrations had been going on before that, but all of a sudden, there was a new spirit. People turned out. The threat that they would be arrested or persecuted, well, people stood up and said, "Wir sind das Volk," we are the people. And as a result, a movement grew that was too powerful for the East German government to suppress. And so by November 9th, 1989, that is just 2 months after these demonstrations started growing, the wall came down. And in about a year, less than a year later, Germany was unified. Now the problem is that the reunification somewhat typified the comment of Friedrich Schiller about the French Revolution, that a great moment found a little people. Now, I don't mean to denigrate the people of Germany. They showed tremendous courage and optimism to stand up against the forces of the East Germans and possibly the Soviet Union, to demonstrate, to come out and say, we want to be reunified. But the problem was that there was no program that was ready for it. The leadership was lacking. And so the LaRouche movement stepped into the breach and came up with a proposal, which was called the Productive Triangle, to take the area between Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, where there was tremendous industrial capability, and extend eastward into Eastern Europe and then to Russia, high-speed rail lines, corridors of development, provide capital goods and credit to the Russians and others to overcome the legacy of communism. This was the program that eventually, under Helga Zepp LaRouche's influence, became the New Silk Road, and now has been adopted as China's policy since 2013. The problem is the Western oligarchy had a different strategy. Their strategy was to dismantle Russia, take away the various republics that had been part of Russia, starting with peeling off the Eastern European, Ukraine and others, but expand NATO eastward to the very borders of Russia, and to send in bankers and predators to figure out what they could steal from Russia, what they could loot. And Russia went through a period of disintegration, which was known as a period of genocide. The population shrank, the life expectancy shrank, And Russia went from being the Soviet Empire to being a shrinking nation that was being looted. Now, what's interesting is that the reunification was October 3rd, 1990. Shortly after that, in January 91, George H.W. Bush, under the influence of Maggie Thatcher, launched Operation Desert Storm, an attack on Iraq, a beginning step to bring down Saddam Hussein. And while NATO itself as a whole didn't endorse this, the UK, France, Canada, and Italy were part of the coalition of the willing, as Bush called it. And this was a turning point, because what became clear was, instead of looking for peaceful solutions, for economic development solutions, for negotiations, diplomacy, instead, war became the policy. And from that time to the present, we've been in virtually a constant state of war, perpetual war, which we see today in Ukraine, and also in a certain way with the backing of the NATO countries of the Netanyahu regime in Israel. So a moment of potential where you had an opportunity to end the division, the geopolitical division of Eurasia, and have Russia and Europe and China and Europe cooperating for economic development of the world. Instead, you had a new form of competition enforced by the idea of the U.S. as the sole superpower. The line in the U.S. was, "We won the Cold War, now you have to do what we say." And that's why you had the period of genocide in Russia, the demographic collapse, and at the same time, the beginnings of these wars. Now, today we have a regional war going out of control in Southwest Asia, with Israel attacking Lebanon after having carried out indiscriminate killing in Gaza. This threatens to become a war of Israel against Iran, in which the Israeli plan is to launch a war and then force the United States to come in to help it win against Iran. This is an extremely dangerous moment, especially because at the same time you have a push from NATO to give Zelensky the go-ahead to use Western missiles to shoot into Russia, deep into Russia. And so we're poised for a moment in a situation much more dangerous, probably than any time, minimally since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, but possibly more dangerous than any other time in history, as the nations squaring off against each other have the nuclear capacity to destroy civilization. Now, our movement is moving into the breach with a strategy for development, to have a peaceful transition and not the war that the Western oligarchy wants. And there was an event yesterday. Germany needs a new security architecture in which the parameters of this potential were laid out. There was a keynote address from Helga LaRouche. There was a very important speech by Jack Matlock, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia during the period I just mentioned, the period of the wall coming down and the transition out of the Soviet Union. Also, Ted Postel, who's one of the leading experts on nuclear war, and a couple of other military analysts were part of the discussion. And what they presented was the real history, not the phony history of freedom and democracy versus autocracy, but the history of the potential that existed that was sabotaged deliberately by the Western oligarchy, which was committed to establishing a unipolar order. Now, to know what to do today, you need to know what happened then, what the forces were, what the dynamic was, and then what the alternative is today. It's time for a peaceful transition away from this unipolar order. And I encourage you to watch the video from yesterday. It's linked in the description section. And also tomorrow, there'll be a keynote address by Helga LaRouche to a BRICS conference taking place in Lima, Peru, which is sponsored by the embassies of a number of the BRICS countries, China, Russia, Brazil, and Helga's one of the speakers, and it's a discussion of how to have global economic cooperation for development. I won't be doing an update tomorrow, but I encourage you to watch this video tomorrow. It's at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And also today at 11 a.m., I'll be doing my weekly interview with Helga LaRouche. So there's a lot of input for you, but it's needed because what we need now is the commitment, an empathetic commitment to human development coming from the advanced sector instead of war, instead of chaos. The world needs a Western alliance that cooperates with the Global South as opposed to tries to suppress it and loot it. And that is what we have to do. That's what you have to do. So watch the videos, and I'll see you next week.